On a typical winter morning, the police department in a small town received 2 alarm calls. The officers went to the house at the indicated address, where a shocking picture awaited them. What happened next resembled the plot of a detective thriller, and it took 7 years to unravel this terrible story. Only after all this time, the truth became known to everyone, but not everyone was ready for such an outcome. Connie Dubate was born on July 31, 1976 in the small American town of Ellington, Connecticut. Her parents also had 2 other daughters and a brother. From an early age, the girl distinguished herself by her kindness and desire to help people, with which she had many friends. In the future, thanks to these qualities, Connie decided to get a medical education. She went to university and then got a job in the sales department of a pharmaceutical company. In addition, Connie became the president of her city's charity, which provided people with emergency medical care free of charge. The girl also wanted to create a large and friendly family. In the early 2000s, she had such an opportunity. She met a man named Richard, and the two began an affair. The couple married on July 4, 2003. And a few years later they had a son. 3 years later, a second boy appeared in the family. Around this time, Connie and Richard decided to get a new home. They bought a large house in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of Ellington, and the family moved there. Over the years, they lived exemplary lives. But on December 23, 2015, everything changed. In the morning of this day, the police department received 2 calls at once. First, they received a call from the security company informing them that the alarm had gone off at Richard and Connie's home. 5 minutes later, Richard himself called the police and asked for help. The officers immediately arrived at the house, where a terrible sight awaited them. One of them went inside through the open front door and immediately noticed a trail of blood that led towards the kitchen, from the stairs to the basement. The policemen proceeded to the kitchen, where they found Richard. The man was partially tied to an overturned chair. Wounds were seen on his body. The police immediately asked for help and began a search both the house and the entire area. Immediately after that, another terrible find awaited them. They went down to the basement and saw Connie's body there, next to which was a gun. Meanwhile, detectives have freed Richard. While they were waiting for the ambulance, the man told what had happened. This morning, he took his sons to the bus stop from which they left for school, after which he returned home. There, he changed into his office clothes, got in his car, and drove to work. Meanwhile, Connie was getting ready for a sports class at the gym of a local charity. Shortly after Richard drove away from the house, he received a notification from security that an alarm had gone off in his home. This was not the first time this had happened, and the reason for this was their cat, which they left at home alone. The man also realized that he had forgotten to take his laptop, which he needed for work, so he decided to go back. Before turning around, he texted his boss that he would be delayed and drove back. Richard returned to the house sometime between 8:45 and 9:30 am. When he went inside, he heard a noise on the second floor. Upstairs, he went into his and Connie's bedroom, and to his horror he saw an unknown man rummaging through their closet. The man was wearing camouflage clothing, and his face was covered. As soon as the culprit spotted Richard, he pounced on him and knocked him to the floor. Then the unknown person demanded to give him his wallet, bank cards, and PIN codes from them. Otherwise, he threatened to wait for his family to return home and kill them. Almost immediately afterward, Richard heard the garage door open. Apparently, Connie returned from her class early. The man shouted that there was someone in the house and told her to run. The culprit headed down, but Richard tried to stop him. In the course of the struggle, an unknown man managed to push him down the stairs, and Richard flew to the first floor. While he was recovering, Connie ran to the basement where they had 2 guns, and the culprit followed her. After a few moments, Richard was able to get up, and also went to the basement. But when he went down there, the unknown man was already holding a gun, and the next second he shot Connie. The sound of the gunshot was so loud that Richard was almost deaf for several minutes. He thought he heard a second bang soon, but he wasn't sure. The perpetrator then forced Richard to sit on a chair and tied his arm and leg to it. Then he put down the gun, took the wire cutters lying in the basement, and stabbed the man several times. After that, an unknown person dumped some things on the floor, took a gas burner, and began to burn them. Apparently, he was trying to get rid of evidence in this way. Then he turned to Richard and pointed the torch at him. Due to the fact that he was only partially tied to the chair, the man managed to get up and knock the torch out of the attacker's hands. He grabbed it and pointed it at him, scorching the mask on his face. The perpetrator, who was left unarmed, immediately ran out of the basement, and shortly thereafter, Richard went upstairs to call the police. While the man was talking about the incident, the police combed the house and the territory several kilometers from him, but they could not find the suspect. The only thing they found was Richard's wallet, which was lying on the front lawn. Investigators invited dog handlers with search dogs to try to take the trail of the killer. They gave them a sniff of the purse, as the criminal had been holding it in his hands for a while. However, it didn't work. 3 different dogs kept bringing the detectives back to Richard. After that, the dog handlers brought the dogs around the house, hoping that they would be able to smell a stranger. But it also did not bring results. This seemed strange to the detectives. Trained dogs are able to detect signs of human presence even after a few days. But in this case, none of the 3 dogs smelled anything. Another strange thing was the timing of what happened. According to Richard, about 5 minutes elapsed between the time he entered the house and the time the perpetrator fled. Given that the men returned home between 8:40 am and 9 am, it should have been over no later than 9:05 am. However, the security firm told the police that the alarm in the house did not go off until 10:16 am, and a few minutes after that, Richard himself called. It turned out that he spent more than an hour in the house before going to the police. In addition, too little time passed between Connie's departure for sports and his return home. In the meantime, the man was taken to the hospital, and doctors found that all the wounds he received were not life-threatening. There, the detectives questioned him again, hoping to get a description of the attacker. Richard said he was tall and large, but because of the mask, it was impossible to see his face. Medical experts examined Connie's body and determined that she had received 2 bullet wounds to the abdomen and back of the head. The detectives didn't actually have any leads, and they kept talking to Richard, hoping to get more details. The more questions they asked, the more suspicious the answers were. Richard also changed his version of events. Initially, he said that he heard a noise on the 2nd floor as soon as he entered the house, but now he says that there was no noise, and he only noticed the perpetrator when he went upstairs and entered the bedroom. But the main discrepancy was related to the moment of the murder. Richard said he ran into the basement and saw the gunman take the gun from Connie and then shoot her. However, he initially said that he did not know how the attacker took possession of the weapon. Another suspicious point was the wounds from the wire cutters that Richard received. All of them were superficial and did not pose any threat, but the most interesting thing is that most of them were on the left side of the body, given that the man was right-handed, and it was his right hand that was not tied to the chair. He could well have inflicted these wounds on himself. In addition, not a single bruise or contusion was found on his body. According to the man, he fought with a criminal and fell down the stairs. All this and other inconsistencies in the testimony led investigators to believe that Richard's story could be made up. They went back to the hospital and asked him if he and Connie had any marital problems. And then the man said he had a mistress, but Connie knew. The detectives had serious doubts about the veracity of this story, as it sounded completely unnatural. They kept asking Richard more questions, and his story changed again. Detectives contacted the woman, and she said she had been romantically involved with Richard less than a year before. She knew he was his wife, but she thought he was in the process of divorcing because he had told her so. The woman became pregnant in June, 6 months before the incident. Richard insisted that he had already hired a lawyer for the divorce and was going to complete the process by the time the child was born. However, investigators found out that the man did not actually go to a lawyer. In addition, all acquaintances, Connie said that she never mentioned the divorce. All of this was enough for detectives to begin to consider Richard as the prime suspect. However, they could not find any solid evidence against him, so the police began to consider all possible options. And here they found out something interesting. Friends and relatives of the family told them that Connie had repeatedly complained about the construction worker, with whom they had serious problems. He did some pool work on their house, and the couple tried to get some of the money back. But the contractor turned out to be very aggressive, and Connie admitted that she was seriously afraid of him. It was because of this problem that she and Richard bought 2 guns and also installed an alarm system. Investigators checked the man, but he had an indisputable alibi for the time of the murder. In the end, they returned to their only suspect, the victim's husband. For months, the police did not tell the public the fact that they believed he was a possible killer. All of Connie's friends and relatives believed that some unknown robber was behind this crime and felt sorry for Richard. Detectives spent a lot of time talking to Connie's closest friends. They stated that the woman would definitely tell them if she found out about her husband's infidelity, especially if his mistress became pregnant. Other acquaintances of the family noted that after the murder, Richard behaved strangely. He didn't seem depressed or upset. And a few days after his wife's death, he even texted a few neighbors where you usually order food. Digging deeper, the police found out that Connie and Richard were experiencing serious financial problems, with the wife not understanding where their money was going, while Richard secretly spent it on his mistress. They also found a note on her smartphone with the title "Why I Want to Get a Divorce." There, the woman listed that Richard was constantly lying, mistreating her and the children, taking her money without asking, and so on. Based on this, the investigators came to the conclusion that Connie herself thought about ending this marriage. However, she had not the slightest idea of her husband's secret life. After examining the financial side of the issue in more detail, the police found out that just 5 days after the murder, Richard tried to withdraw $500,000 from his wife's insurance account. But the security service rejected this application. A month later, he received a check for $75,000 from his wife's employer. All this indicated that Richard might have had a mercenary motive for the murder, but did not prove his guilt. Another curious fact was that Richard canceled his contract with the security firm just 19 days after the murder. If his story about the perpetrator were true, it would be the most illogical move, endangering not only the man himself, but also his 2 sons. Trying to find at least some clues, the detectives received warrant examinations of all the electronic devices from the house. And here something serious was finally waiting for them. By gathering all this information, the police were able to reconstruct the exact chronology of events. At 8:44 a.m. that morning, the security system recorded the garage door opening and closing. Investigators determined that it was Connie who went to practice. Soon she was caught on cameras near the gym. Richard, who was still at home at the time, first turned off the alarm and then turned it back on. To do this, he had to leave the house and go to work. But at 8:59 a.m., the man turned off the alarm again and used his remote control. Given that it operates only a few meters away from the system itself, Richard had to return home. This coincided with his account of driving back to pick up a laptop. But there was one problem. The man said that he received a notification that the alarm went off on his way to work. However, during this period of time, the security system did not record any violations, which means that he did not receive any notifications. It turned out that the man spent at least 4 minutes in the house before he discovered the robber. And everything that happened next took less than 1 minute, which was impossible even in theory. But the most important evidence was the testimony of Connie's fitness bracelet. She arrived at the gym, but left a few minutes later because classes had been canceled. At 9:08 a.m., the bracelets stopped reading steps. Based on this, investigators concluded that Connie got into the car and drove home. The journey took 8 minutes, and this is where the fun began. According to Richard, the perpetrator attacked his wife almost immediately after she entered the house, but the data from the bracelet refuted this. The woman walked 370 meters inside her house. Data from her social media account also showed that she had been online for 1 hour. It turns out that Connie was alive for almost an hour, which was completely inconsistent with her husband's story. An important factor here was that the police had not just theoretical inconsistencies in their hands, but full-fledged digital evidence. It took the police more than a year to gather this detailed information, and in April 2017, they finally arrested Richard. For the vast majority of his acquaintances, this event was a real shock. All of them had no idea what evidence the police had managed to get her and continued to believe Richard was the victim. The man was charged with murder, and at first they wanted to set him bail of $5 million. However, his lawyer insisted that Richard has a clean criminal history, as well as 2 minor sons in his care. As a result, the amount was reduced to $1 million, and he immediately contributed this money. Richard spent 5 years awaiting trial, as the trial was constantly postponed. It began only in April 2022, and during this time, the man's lawyers managed to collect many interesting facts. The defense provided evidence that 6 DNA samples belonging to an unknown person were found in the house. They also pointed out that a very small amount of gunpowder was found on Richard's hands. If he had been the one who shot Connie, there should have been a lot more of him. The prosecution refuted these arguments. A gunpowder sample was taken only a few hours after the man was brought to the hospital. In that time, Richard might well have erased most of the tracks. As for the DNA, there was no evidence that it belonged to a mysterious criminal, and these samples could have been left by anyone who had visited Richard and Connie's home at least once. In turn, the prosecution presented a detailed digital map of the couple's movements that morning, which refuted absolutely all of Richard's statements. Evidence indicated that the woman died an hour after she was allegedly shot by an unknown robber. Up until that point, she had been moving around the house and using social media as if nothing had happened. Richard's story itself also became a weighty argument for the prosecution, since the man changed his testimony more than once. The trial lasted 22 days, and on May 10, 2022, the jury found him guilty. Richard was sentenced to 65 years in prison, but he continued to insist on his innocence. This trial was an ordeal for Connie's family and friends, as they only found out about all the evidence against her husband during the trial itself. Up to this point, many of them had continued to believe in the story of the unknown robber. But after all the cards were laid out on the table, no one doubted Richard's guilt. As for Connie's sons, they stayed with their mother's relatives. At the time of the murder, they were 6 and 9 years old, but the children lived with their father until the sentencing.